You didn't just choose her, Jax, Alara said, her voice dropping to a terrifying quiet. You paraded her in front of the pack while I was bleeding for our borders. Jax stood in the center of the mahogany-paneled study, the faint scent of jasmine, her jasmine, clinging to his collar. It's politics, Alara. The Silver Moon Pack demanded an alliance. You know I can't reject a destined union when the elders are watching. A destined union, she repeated, the words tasting like ash. She looked at the man she had loved since childhood, the mate she had bled for, and saw only a stranger wearing his face. Then, I suppose you won't mind if I leave. Before he could form a rebuttal, before he could reach for the bond that was already fraying. She turned her back on him and walked out into the rain. The rain had been a blessing, washing away the scent of her despair before it could permeate the packlands. Alara hadn't packed a bag. She hadn't left a note. She simply walked out of the Blood Moon territory, the territory she had spent her life defending as their lead warrior, and vanished into the dense, ancient woods of the neutral zone. 3 weeks had passed since that night. 3 weeks of surviving on instinct, of burying the agonizing, tearing sensation of a rejected mate bond deep within her chest. She had found refuge in an abandoned hunting cabin near the edge of the sprawling Ironhide territory, a place notorious for its unforgiving terrain and even more unforgiving alpha. Tonight, the wind howled through the cracked window pane, carrying the metallic tang of an approaching storm. Alara sat cross-legged on the dusty floorboards, sharpening her hunting knife with rhythmic, methodical strokes. The scrape of stone against steel was the only sound keeping the silence at bay. She tried not to think of Jax. She tried not to think of the way he had looked at Serena, the Silver Moon Princess, with a mixture of awe and possession that had shattered Alara's heart. She had fought rogues, defended their borders, and trained their warriors, all while he secretly courted the destined Luna the elders insisted upon. The betrayal wasn't just the affair, it was the cowardly justification. A sudden snap of a twig outside shattered her concentration. Alara froze. Her wolf, dormant and grieving for weeks, stirred with a low, warning growl. The neutral zone was dangerous, teeming with rogues and outcasts. But the scent that drifted through the cracks in the cabin walls wasn't foul like a rogue's. It was sharp, overwhelming, and terrifyingly potent. Petrichor, dark pine, and a power that made the air itself vibrate. It was an alpha. And not just any alpha. She extinguished the single candle with a swift puff of breath, plunging the cabin into darkness. Moving with silent, practiced grace, she pressed her back against the wall beside the door, her grip tightening on the hilt of her knife. Heavy footsteps approached the porch. They didn't sneak. They walked with the deliberate, arrogant stride of someone who owned the earth they walked on. I know you're in there, a voice rumbled, deep enough to rattle the loose floorboards. It held no anger, only an absolute, chilling certainty. And I know you're not a rogue, Alara of the Blood Moon. Her breath hitched. No one should know she was here. No one should know her name. Go away, she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through her veins. This is neutral territory. I claim sanctuary. A low chuckle, devoid of humor, drifted through the thin wood. Sanctuary is a myth created by weak packs to feel safe. And you, little warrior, are trespassing on the edge of my lands. The door didn't burst open. It was simply pushed inward with a force that snapped the rusty lock like a twig. Lightning illuminated the doorway, framing a silhouette that seemed too large for the frame. He stepped inside, bringing the storm with him. Broad shoulders, a sharp, unyielding jawline, and eyes that glowed a faint, luminescent silver in the darkness. Alpha King Cassian. He was a legend spoken of in hushed, fearful tones around campfires. The ruler of the largest coalition of packs in the Northern Hemisphere, a man known for his brutal efficiency and uncompromising laws. Elara didn't lower her knife. "I'm not looking for trouble, King Cassian. I'm just passing through." "You've been passing through for 3 weeks," he observed, stepping further into the cramped space. He seemed unbothered by the blade pointed at him. His gaze swept over her, taking in her ragged clothes, the dark circles under her eyes, and the defensive posture she held. "Jax is tearing apart the southern borders looking for you." The mention of Jax's name was a physical blow. Her hand trembled slightly before she forced it still. "He shouldn't bother. I'm no longer his concern." Cassian tilted his head, his silver eyes narrowing. A mate doesn't simply vanish without consequence. The Blood Moon Pack is in chaos. He claims you were kidnapped. Kidnapped? Elara let out a harsh, bitter laugh. Is that what he told the elders to save face? Tell him to look closer to home. Perhaps his new Luna knows where I am. The Alpha King didn't smile, but a flicker of something resembling intrigue sparked in his eyes. He chose the Silver Moon Girl over his lead warrior. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an assessment of a strategic blunder. A foolish move for an alpha trying to secure his borders. "It's not my problem anymore," Elara said coldly. "Now, if you don't mind, I'd like you to leave." Cassian took another step forward, closing the distance between them until he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him. The sheer predatory power rolling off him was suffocating, forcing her wolf into a submissive whine she ruthlessly suppressed. "You misunderstand your situation, Elara," he said softly, the rumble of his voice vibrating in her chest. "You are a highly skilled warrior, carrying the scent of a recently broken bond, hiding on the edge of my territory. You are a vulnerability, and I do not tolerate vulnerabilities near my borders." "Are you going to kill me then?" she challenged, raising her chin. "No," Cassian said, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'm going to take you with me." "Take me with you?" Elara echoed, her voice lacing with a dangerous edge. She tightened her grip on the hunting knife, the worn leather hilt a familiar comfort against her palm. "I am not a stray you can leash, Cassian. I don't belong to Jax anymore, and I certainly don't belong to you." Cassian didn't flinch at her use of his first name, nor did he glance at the blade still aimed at his chest. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step back, giving her the illusion of space. "You belong to no one but yourself," Cassian replied, his tone infuriatingly even. "But right now, yourself is starving, exhausted, and vibrating with the toxic fallout of a severed mate bond. You are bleeding out, Elara. Not physically, but spiritually." Elara's jaw tightened. She wanted to deny it, to tell him to go to hell. But a sudden, violent spasm in her chest stole the breath from her lungs. It was the bond. Jax hadn't completed a formal rejection ritual, and neither had she. The unresolved connection was rotting inside her, a phantom limb that ached with every beat of her heart. She doubled over slightly, a ragged cough tearing from her throat before she could stop it. Before she could recover, Cassian moved. He wasn't aggressive, merely impossibly fast. His large hand wrapped over hers, forcing the tip of her knife downward. His skin was scorching hot against her freezing fingers. "My vehicle is a mile down the ridge," he stated, leaving no room for debate. "You can stay here and let the bond sickness consume your mind, or you can ride with me and live long enough to figure out your next move. I offer shelter, not captivity. Choose." Pride warred with survival. Alara looked into those luminescent silver eyes, searching for a trap, a lie, a hidden agenda. She saw only the cold, calculating truth of a king who didn't waste his time on trivial games. With a stiff nod, she sheathed the knife at her thigh. The trek through the storm was brutal, but Cassian led the way, his broad back breaking the wind. When they reached the dirt road, a sleek, heavily armored black SUV waited with its engine purring. The driver, a mountain of a man with the unmistakable scent of an enforcer, didn't even blink as Alara climbed into the passenger cabin. The interior smelled of rich leather and Cassian's overpowering scent. Petrichor and dark pine. As the king slid into the seat opposite her, the doors locked with a heavy, final thud. The drive was agonizingly silent. Alara stared out the tinted window, watching the rain blur the towering pines. The warmth of the vehicle only seemed to aggravate the hollow ache in her chest. A memory flashed unbidden. Jax's laugh in the training yard, his hands on her waist, promising her they would lead the pack together. Liar. The memory shattered into jagged pieces, replaced by the image of Serena standing on the Alpha's balcony, draped in Jax's ceremonial cloak. Alara squeezed her eyes shut, a soft gasp escaping her lips as another spasm hit her chest. "Turn the heat up, Marcus," Cassian murmured, his gaze fixed on Alara. "I'm fine," she gritted out, wiping a sheen of cold sweat from her forehead. "Lying is a poor trait for a warrior," Cassian noted dryly. "The sickness will peak in another week. After that, either the bond will snap entirely, or it will drag you into madness." "I won't go mad." "We shall see." 2 hours later, the dense forest parted to reveal the Ironhide Keep. Alara had expected a brutalist fortress, something matching the rumors of the bloodthirsty king. Instead, she was met with a sprawling, ultra-modern compound built seamlessly into the jagged cliffside. Walls of reinforced black glass reflected the moonlight, and heavily armed patrols moved with flawless, terrifying synchronization along the perimeter. This wasn't just a pack. This was an empire. As the SUV pulled into an underground transport bay, Cassian unbuckled his seatbelt. He paused, turning his silver gaze onto her. "Once we step out of this vehicle, you are under my protection," he said, his voice dropping to a low rumble that resonated in her bones. "My pack will not question you. They will not touch you. But make no mistake, Alara. You are here because I require something from you." Alara met his stare, her warrior instincts flaring to life, pushing back the pain. What could the Alpha King possibly need from a broken wolf? A ghost of a smirk played on his lips. "You aren't broken. You're just recalibrating. Come." Cassian's private study sat on the top floor of the keep, boasting a panoramic view of the dark, sprawling valley below. The room was a study in controlled power. Minimalist furniture, walls lined with ancient tactical tomes mixed with modern servers, and a massive fireplace crackling with blue-tinged flames. "Drink," Cassian commanded softly, setting a heavy crystal tumbler of amber liquid on the edge of his obsidian desk. Alara remained standing by the door, her arms crossed tight over her damp jacket. "I don't drink on duty." "You have no duty," he reminded her. The words were softly spoken, but they cut like a scalpel. She flinched, the truth of it sinking in. She wasn't the led warrior of the Blood Moon anymore. She was a rogue, an outcast. She walked forward and took the glass, downing the whiskey in one fiery swallow. It burned down her throat, momentarily distracting her from the ache in her chest. Cassian watched her, leaning back against the edge of his desk. He looked far too comfortable for a man standing 2 feet from a trained killer. I brought you here because Jax isn't just looking for you, Alara. He's weaponizing your absence. Alara frowned, setting the empty glass down. What does that mean? I told you, he just wants to save face in front of the elders. He doesn't want them to know he tossed me aside for the Silver Moon Alliance. Cassian picked up a remote and pointed it at the wall. A massive digital map flickered to life, showing the borders of the Northern Territories. He pressed a button, and clusters of red dots illuminated along the southern edge of the neutral zone. Drone footage from the last 48 hours. Cassian explained, his tone shifting into something purely clinical and authoritative. Jax is mobilizing his border patrols. He isn't quietly searching for a runaway mate. He is publicly mourning an abducted hero. Alara's breath caught. She stared at the red dots, her mind racing. Abducted? He presented a formal petition to the High Council yesterday. Cassian continued, his silver eyes watching her reaction closely. He claims a rogue faction, allegedly funded by the Ironhide Pack, ambushed you during a border patrol and dragged you into my lands. The silence in the room was absolute. Alara felt the blood drain from her face as the sheer scale of Jax's deception clicked into place. It wasn't just cowardice. It was calculated. It was opportunistic. He's using me as a casus belli, she whispered, her voice trembling, not with sorrow, but with a sudden, searing rage. He wants the neutral zone. He wants the river access on your southern border, and he's using my disappearance to justify an invasion to the council. Exactly, Cassian said. He walked around the desk, closing the distance between them. He gets his Silver Moon Princess, a political alliance, and a righteous war that paints him as a grieving, vengeful alpha. It is a very clever move. I didn't think the boy had it in him. Don't call him a boy, Alara snapped instinctively, though the defense tasted like poison on her tongue. She looked up at Cassian. If you know it's a lie, tell the council. Expose him. The council requires proof, Alara. To them, you are a ghost. And if I simply killed Jax's forces when they crossed the border, I validate his claims of my hostility. Cassian stopped right in front of her. The sheer height and breadth of him forced her to tilt her head up. I don't play defensive games. I end wars before they begin. So, what is your proposition? She asked, her voice steadying as her tactical mind took over. You are the architect of the Blood Moon's current military structure. You trained the very forces sitting on my border, Cassian said. I want you to train my elite vanguard. Show them the flaws in the formations you built. Teach them how to dismantle Jax's army without shedding a drop of Ironhide blood. Alara stared at him, stunned. You want me to commit treason? You owe no loyalty to a pack that allowed its alpha to cast you aside. Cassian countered smoothly, his voice dropping lower, vibrating with a dangerous magnetism. And when the time is right, when Jax attempts to march his forces across my border, you will step out of the shadows. You will stand beside me, very much alive, and expose him as a liar and a fraud to the entire council. A violent shudder racked Alara's body. The bond sickness flared in response to the thought of directly opposing her former mate, the pain so sharp she stumbled forward. Before she could hit the floor, Cassian caught her. His massive arms wrapped around her shoulders, holding her upright with effortless strength. The sudden contact sent a jolt of electricity through her system. For the first time since the night in the rain, the agonizing pain in her chest dulled, soothed by the overwhelming, commanding presence of the Alpha King's aura. Breathe, little warrior," he murmured, his breath warm against the shell of her ear. It was a surprising moment of gentleness, a stark contrast to the ruthless king who had just proposed she destroy her former home. Alara gripped the fabric of his shirt, gasping as the pain slowly receded. She looked up into his silver eyes, seeing the reflection of her own broken, furious soul. Jax had taken her heart, her pack, and her dignity. Now, he was trying to use her memory to steal land. "I'll do it," she whispered against Cassian's chest. "I'll train your men, and then I'll destroy him." The Ironhide training grounds were a theater of controlled brutality. Nestled in a natural ravine behind the main keep, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, sweat, and the sharp copper tang of minor bloodshed. 50 of Cassian's most elite warriors, the vanguard, stood in loose, relaxed formations on the packed dirt. They were massive, heavily muscled brutes, veterans of countless border skirmishes, and they were all currently staring at Alara with varying degrees of skepticism. Alara stood before them, dressed in borrowed black tactical gear that felt slightly too heavy. She ignored the dull throb in her chest, a persistent reminder of the fraying bond with Jax, and focused on the wall of muscle in front of her. "This is a joke, right?" muttered a towering wolf with a jagged scar across his jaw. Kyle, the vanguard captain. "The king wants a blood moon runaway to teach us how to fight?" Alara didn't raise her voice, but she allowed the cold, unyielding authority of a led warrior to bleed into her tone. "Your king wants me to teach you how not to die when you face the blood moon phalanx, Captain. Because right now, you fight like a sledgehammer, devastating but completely predictable." A ripple of low growls passed through the ranks. Kyle stepped forward, rolling his shoulders. "Predictable? We break enemy lines in minutes. We don't need fancy dancing. We need force. Force is useless against a fluid defense." Alara countered smoothly. She walked toward the weapons rack, pulling free a blunt, weighted training staff. She tossed it to Kyle, who caught it effortlessly, and grabbed 2 short, rubber-edged training blades for herself. "Show me. Strike to kill." Kyle hesitated, glancing up toward the black glass balconies of the keep. Alara didn't need to look to know Cassian was there, watching. "The king gave his orders." Kale grunted, his eyes narrowing. "Don't blame me if you break." He lunged. For a man of his immense size, Kale was terrifyingly fast. The staff blurred, arcing toward Alara's ribs with bone-crushing force. Alara didn't block. Blocking a strike like that would shatter her forearms. Instead, she pivoted, dropping low and stepping inside his guard. As the heavy staff whistled harmlessly past her shoulder, she used his own momentum against him, sweeping her boot behind his ankle while simultaneously driving the pommel of her training blade into the nerve cluster beneath his arm. Kale let out a sharp hiss of pain, his leg buckling. Before he could recover, Alara spun, hooking her leg around his knee and dragging him to the dirt in a cloud of dust. In a fraction of a second, she had a knee pinned between his shoulder blades, and the edge of her blunt blade pressed firmly against his carotid artery. Total silence descended on the ravine. The vanguard stared in shock. Their captain, neutralized in less than 3 seconds. "You telegraphed the strike by dropping your right shoulder," Alara said, her breathing barely elevated. She released him and stepped back, offering a hand. The Blood Moon Vanguard is trained to look for micro-expressions. They don't block your force, they redirect it. If you hit their shield wall like that, they'll trap your weapon, flank you, and cut your hamstring before you can blink. Kale ignored her hand, pushing himself up and brushing the dirt from his tactical vest. He looked at her, the skepticism in his eyes replaced by a begrudging, cautious respect. "And you can teach us to break this fluid defense." "I built it," Alara said, her voice turning grim as she looked out over the 50 warriors. "I know every weakness, every blind spot, and every contingency. But to beat them, you have to stop fighting like lone predators and start fighting like a single, cohesive organism. You have to learn patience." For the next 4 hours, Alara put the vanguard through hell. She stripped away their reliance on brute force, drilling them on synchronized footwork, feints, and counterstrikes. She was merciless, correcting postures and demanding perfection. The physical exertion was exhausting, but it served a secondary purpose. It quieted the screaming void in her soul. When she finally called an end to the session, the men were drenched in sweat, panting and moving with a new, mindful precision. Alara walked toward the armory to stow her weapons, her muscles trembling with fatigue. As she rounded the corner into the shadowed corridor, a sudden, familiar wave of heat washed over her. Cassian stepped out of the shadows. He wore a crisp, dark shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. His silver eyes swept over her flushed face and damp hair. "They respect strength," Cassian noted, his deep voice echoing slightly in the narrow hall. "You proved yours." "They are undisciplined," Alara replied, wiping a streak of dirt from her cheek. "But they are fast learners. In a week, they'll be able to dismantle Jax's front line." "And what about you?" Cassian asked, taking a step closer. The scent of petrichor and pine wrapped around her, instantly soothing the ragged edges of her anxiety. "How is the pain?" Alara looked down. "Manageable, as long as I keep moving." Cassian reached out, his long, calloused fingers gently tilting her chin up so she was forced to look at him. The touch was electric, sending a jolt straight to her dormant wolf. "Moving only delays the inevitable, Alara. The bond is reaching critical mass. You cannot outrun it forever." The inevitable arrived 3 nights later, tearing through Alara like a jagged blade in the dark. She was in the keep's vast library, poring over topographic maps of the neutral zone. Cassian was across the room, quietly reviewing Border Patrol logs. The silence was comfortable, a companionable quiet they had fallen into over the past week. Without warning, the air was sucked from Alara's lungs. A vision, startling in its clarity, flashed behind her eyes. It wasn't a memory. It was a real-time projection born of the dying mate bond. She saw Jax, his face illuminated by firelight, leaning in to kiss Serena. She felt the sickening rush of his contentment, his affection for the other Luna, directly injected into her own bloodstream. It was a psychic violation of the highest order. Alara choked, her hands flying to her chest as if she had been shot. The map tablet slipped from her grasp, shattering on the stone floor. She collapsed, her knees hitting the ground hard. It felt as though a physical tether attached to her heart was being pulled violently backward, dragging her soul through broken glass. "Alara." Cassian was there instantly. He dropped to his knees beside her, his massive hands gripping her shoulders. It's snapping," she gasped, her vision blurring at the edges. A cold sweat drenched her skin, and a violent tremor racked her body. This was the bond sickness at its peak, the fatal shock that occurred when an unrejected mate bond was forcefully overridden by another union. Jax was marking Serena. "Look at me," Cassian commanded. His voice wasn't just loud. It resonated with the absolute crushing weight of his alpha command. It bypassed her panic, echoing directly in her mind. She forced her eyes open, meeting his glowing silver gaze. Your body is going into spiritual shock, Cassian said, his jaw clenched tight. The connection to the Blood Moon Alpha is dying, and it's trying to drag your wolf down with it. I have to anchor you. How? She managed to whisper, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. By overwhelming his signature with mine, Cassian stated. He didn't ask for permission, knowing she didn't have the breath to give it. He moved his hands from her shoulders, framing her face. His palms were scorching hot. He pressed his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. Suddenly, the suffocating aura of the Alpha King, the power that usually brought lesser wolves to their knees, flooded into her. But it wasn't aggressive. It was a massive, protective shield. Cassian was essentially wrapping his own dominant spiritual energy around her fraying soul, creating a temporary dam against the agony of Jax's betrayal. Elara gasped as the scent of petrichor and dark pine eradicated the phantom smell of jasmine. The warmth radiating from Cassian seeped into her bones, battling the icy grip of the breaking bond. It was an incredibly intimate invasion. She could feel the vast, terrifying depth of his power, the ancient strength of the Ironhide lineage, and beneath it all, a surprising, steadfast stillness. For agonizing minutes, they remained locked together on the library floor. Elara clung to Cassian's forearms, her nails digging into his skin as the final, agonizing threads of her connection to Jax snapped one by one. With every break, Cassian pushed more of his energy into the void, stabilizing her heartbeat, forcing her to breathe with his rhythm. Finally, the tearing sensation ceased, replaced by a hollow, aching emptiness. Elara slumped forward, her head resting against Cassian's broad chest. She was exhausted, utterly drained, but she was alive. The toxic link to the Blood Moon Alpha was gone. Cassian didn't pull away. He kept his arms wrapped securely around her, one hand gently stroking the back of her head, soothing her trembling wolf. It's done, he murmured, his voice a low rumble against her ear. He cannot touch you anymore. Elara squeezed her eyes shut, a single tear escaping. Not for the loss of Jax, but for the profound relief of finally being free of him. She inhaled deeply, her senses now entirely filled with Cassian. The realization hit her with sudden clarity. He hadn't just shielded her, he had left an indelible mark of his own energy on her spirit. Before she could process what that meant, the heavy oak doors of the library flew open. Marcus, Cassian's driver and highest-ranking enforcer, stood in the doorway, his chest heaving slightly. He took in the scene, his king holding the Blood Moon warrior on the floor. But his expression remained stoic. "Forgive the intrusion, Alpha," Marcus said, his voice clipped and urgent. Cassian slowly opened his eyes, the silver glow fading to a steely, dangerous gray. He didn't release Elara, but his posture went rigid. "Report." "Scouts just checked in from the southern ridge," Marcus said grimly. "Jax's forces have crossed the first river marker. They are officially in the neutral zone. The invasion has begun." The intimacy of the moment vanished, entirely consumed by the chilling reality of Marcus's words. Jax was actually doing it. He was marching an army under false pretenses, risking hundreds of lives for his own territorial greed. Cassian released Elara, standing up in one fluid, powerful motion. The protective anchor he had cast over her retracted slightly, but a warm, undeniable hum remained in her chest. A tether not of subjugation, but of mutual survival. She took a deep, steadying breath, realizing the crippling phantom pain of Jax was entirely gone. Her wolf, dormant and grieving for weeks, stood at attention, clear-eyed and hungry. How many? Cassian asked Marcus, his voice a lethal whisper that commanded the vast library. 3 battalions, Marcus replied, handing over a glowing data pad. Close to 600 wolves. They are moving in a standard wedge formation, pushing through the White Pine Valley. They expect to hit our southern border checkpoint by dawn. Elara climbed to her feet. Her legs were shaky, but her mind was suddenly razor-sharp. The tactician within her overrode the spiritual exhaustion. A wedge formation is designed for rapid penetration, not sustained combat. He's trying to punch a hole through your defenses before the High Council observers can fully document the engagement. Cassian turned his silver gaze to her. Can you fight? It wasn't a question of permission. It was a military assessment. Elara met his eyes, feeling the residual heat of his aura thrumming in her veins. I no longer have a severed bond bleeding me dry, Cassian. I have clarity, and I know precisely how Jax intends to move. Cassian nodded once, a definitive gesture of trust that sent a jolt of pride through her. Marcus, mobilize the vanguard. We meet them at the Whispering Gorge before they can establish a foothold on our side of the river. The keep transformed instantly from a quiet sanctuary into a humming engine of war. Alarms didn't blare. Iron-hide discipline was too refined for panic, but the corridors filled with the rhythmic thud of armored boots and the sharp scent of ozone and adrenaline. In the armory, Elara stripped off her civilian clothes and strapped on a set of matte black iron-hide tactical armor. It was lighter than Blood Moon gear, designed for lethal speed rather than absorbing heavy blows. As she locked her combat harness into place, the door hissed open. Cassian stepped in. He was fully armored, the dark plating accentuating the sheer width of his shoulders and the dangerous grace of his movements. He carried a pair of twin obsidian daggers, their edges gleaming with a deadly, iridescent sheen. He held them out to her. Standard issue blades won't hold up against a phalanx shield, Cassian said, his voice quiet amidst the distant sounds of mobilization. These were forged in the northern caves. They will cut through reinforced carbon. Elara took the daggers. They were perfectly balanced, the hilts wrapping to her grip as if custom-made. You're trusting me with an awful lot, King Cassian. I am, technically, an enemy combatant. You were an enemy yesterday, Cassian corrected, stepping closer until the toes of his boots nearly touched hers. The scent of pine and impending storm rolled off him. Today, you are the weapon I am pointing at the throat of a usurper. He paused, his gaze dropping to her chest, right over where the mate bond used to be. And you carry my anchor, Elara. My wolf recognizes yours. I do not question loyalty when my own spirit answers for it. The admission hung in the air, heavy and profound. It wasn't a confession of love. They were warriors on the brink of battle, not teenagers in a romance novel. But it was an acknowledgement of something infinitely more binding. Fated mates were rare, often dismissed as folklore. But the way her soul had seamlessly accepted his energy, it defied logic. Before she could formulate a response, the comms unit on Cassian's shoulder crackled. Vanguard is loaded, Alpha, awaiting your command. Cassian didn't break eye contact with Elara. Let's go teach your former Alpha the price of his ambition. The convoy of armored transports tore through the night, a silent black steel serpent winding down the mountain pass. Inside the lead vehicle, Elara sat across from Kyle and the vanguard. The skepticism that had clouded their eyes a week ago was gone. They watched her with focused intensity, waiting for her breakdown of the enemy. Jax will place his heavy infantry in the center, Elara explained, tracing a glowing map projected on the transport's floor. He relies on brute force to create panic. Do not engage the center. Let the wedge push through. Let them feel victorious for 30 seconds. Then, Kyle, you collapse the flanks. The fluid defense you taught us, Kale grunted, a feral grin touching his scarred face. We bend, let them in, and snap the trap shut. Exactly, Alara said, her voice hard. But remember the objective. We aren't here to slaughter Blood Moon wolves. Most of them believe they are avenging my death. They are being used. She looked at Cassian, who sat beside her, radiating calm authority. We disarm, we disable, and we hold the line until the Alpha King addresses the usurper. Chapter 7. The Front Lines. The Whispering Gorge earned its name from the wind that continually howled through the narrow, rocky canyon, masking the sounds of the rushing river below. By the time the Ironhide convoy arrived, a thick, freezing fog had rolled in off the water, reducing visibility to mere yards. It was the perfect terrain for an ambush, and the absolute worst place for a heavy infantry wedge to fight. Jax's tactical blunders were already showing. Alara lay prone on a ridge overlooking the shallowest part of the river, the only viable crossing point. Beside her, hidden perfectly among the damp ferns and dark rocks, Kyle and 20 Vanguard elites waited in absolute silence. Across the gorge, through the swirling mist, the rhythmic, heavy thud of marching boots vibrated against the stone. They were coming. A dozen figures emerged from the fog on the opposite bank. Alara's breath caught, her hand tightening reflexively on the hilt of her obsidian dagger. It was the Blood Moon Vanguard, men and women she had trained. She recognized faces, Theron, whose defensive stance she had corrected 100 times, Lyra, who owed her life to Alara during a rogue attack last winter. Seeing them marching under Jax's banner, believing her dead, sent a twist of bitter sorrow through her gut. Then he appeared. Jax stepped onto the rocky shoreline, flanked by his elite guard. He wore ceremonial silver armor, gleaming and impractical, looking every bit the righteous, grieving monarch. And beside him, swathed in a heavy fur cloak, was Serena. The new Luna looked pale and deeply uncomfortable, her eyes darting nervously around the imposing, fog-choked gorge. Behind Jax's front line, a small cluster of older wolves in austere white robes stood observing. The High Council. Jax had brought witnesses to validate his defensive strike. He was playing the politics perfectly. Hold the line. Cassian's voice crackled softly in Alara's earpiece. The Alpha King was not on the ridge with her. He was waiting down by the water's edge, obscured by the mist. Jax raised a hand, halting his forces. He stepped forward, his voice magically amplified to carry over the rushing water. Ironhide! Jax's voice boomed, thick with manufactured grief and righteous fury. I am Alpha Jax of the Blood Moon. I cross into this neutral zone not as a conqueror, but as a husband seeking justice. Your rogue factions have stolen my mate, my lead warrior. Produce those responsible, or we will march upon your keep and tear it down stone by stone. The audacity of the lie made Alara's blood boil. She shifted, ready to signal Kale to initiate the flanking maneuver. But Cassian's command held her back. From the dense fog on the Ironhide side of the river, a single figure emerged. Cassian walked out onto the slick river stones. He wore no ceremonial armor, only his dark tactical gear. He didn't shout. He didn't posture. He simply projected his alpha aura, a suffocating mountainous wave of dominant power that rolled across the river and physically forced several Blood Moon warriors to take a step back. Even from the ridge, Alara felt the sheer weight of it. You trespass on my borders, boy. Cassian's voice wasn't amplified, but its low, rumbling frequency cut through the roar of the river with terrifying clarity. And you do so under the guise of a pathetic lie. Jax bristled, his face flushing with anger at being addressed so dismissively in front of his new Luna and the council. Watch your tongue, Cassian. The council observes this day. Hand over Alara's killers, and we will retreat. Refuse, and your blood will stain this river. You are a coward, Jax of the Blood Moon, Cassian replied, taking a slow step into the shallow water. The water swirled around his boots, but he seemed entirely unbothered by the freezing temperature. You rejected your mate for a political alliance. You drove her into the woods, and now you use her memory to steal land. It is a sloppy, desperate maneuver. The council members murmured among themselves, their white robes shifting in the fog. Serena looked sharply at Jax, panic flashing in her eyes. Jax's facade cracked slightly, a muscle in his jaw ticking. Lies, Jax roared, drawing a broadsword. She was taken from me. My pack mourns her. We will have vengeance. He raised his sword, preparing to order the charge. The Blood Moon vanguard tensed, lifting their shields. Kyle looked at Alara, waiting for the nod, but Cassian simply stopped walking. He stood in the center of the river, an immovable object facing a tidal wave of misplaced fury. He looked up toward the ridge, his silver eyes piercing the fog. I have no interest in killing your pack to correct your cowardice, Jax, Cassian said smoothly, his voice carrying perfectly to the ridge. If the council requires proof of your treason. Cassian raised a hand, gesturing to the cliffs above. Let them hear it from the dead. Alara stood up. She pushed back the dark, optical camouflage netting that had concealed her against the damp ferns, stepping onto the lip of the ridge. The freezing wind immediately caught her hair, whipping it around her face. Clad in the matte black tactical armor of the Ironhide Vanguard, she looked less like a runaway and more like a god of war carved from obsidian. For a long, agonizing second, the thick fog rolling off the Whispering Gorge obscured her from the riverbank below. Then the wind shifted, tearing a rift through the mist. Down in the shallow, rushing water, the Blood Moon phalanx froze. The unified, terrifying machine of muscle and steel ground to a jarring halt. Goddess above, a voice whispered. It was Lyra. Even over the roar of the water, Alara could see the young warrior's lips move, could see the heavy tower shield slip a fraction of an inch as her arms went slack with shock. Beside her, Theron took a staggering step backward, his eyes wide, completely breaking formation. A ripple of panicked murmurs tore through the ranks. They had marched to war to avenge her. Now, their martyred hero was looking down at them, perfectly alive, standing shoulder to shoulder with the shadows of the Ironhide elite. Jax's face drained of all color. He stared up at the ridge, his jaw slack, the magnificent, righteous fury he had projected only moments ago evaporating into pure, unadulterated terror. No, Jax stammered, his voice cracking. He pointed a trembling, armored finger toward the ridge. It's a trick, an illusion. The Ironhide witches are playing with our minds. Alara didn't shout. She didn't need to. She stepped off the ridge, navigating the treacherous, slick stone path down toward the water with practiced, lethal grace. Kyle and the vanguard melted out of the fog behind her, a silent wall of black armor flanking her descent. But she waved them back with a single, sharp hand gesture. This was her fight. She reached the pebbled shoreline, stopping just 10 paces from where Cassian stood in the river. She didn't look at the Alpha King. She locked her gaze entirely on the man who had broken her heart and tried to weaponize her memory. "The only trick played here today, Jax," Alara said, her voice carrying a cold, terrifying authority that made several Blood Moon warriors instinctively lower their weapons, "is the one you played on our elders, on our pack." She bypassed Jax entirely, turning her attention to the small cluster of white-robed High Council members. The elder at the front, a formidable woman named Vanya, with eyes like chips of flint, stepped out from behind Jax's elite guard. "Identify yourself," Elder Vanya demanded, though the tremor of recognition in her voice betrayed her. "I am Alara, formerly the lead warrior of the Blood Moon Pack," she declared, her posture rigidly perfect. "I was not kidnapped by rogue factions. I was not ambushed. 3 weeks ago, Alpha Jax presented Serena of the Silver Moon to the pack as his chosen Luna, despite our existing, unconsummated mate bond. He did this in secret, while I was deployed on the northern border." A collective gasp echoed from the Blood Moon warriors. Serena, swathed in her heavy fur cloak, whipped her head around to stare at Jax, her eyes wide with horror. "You told me she was dead," Serena whispered, her voice trembling. "You told me she died in a rogue attack months before we met." Jax swallowed hard, sweat beading on his forehead despite the biting chill of the gorge. "Serena, my love, please. I left the territory of my own volition, seeking sanctuary in the neutral zone to survive the spiritual rot of a severed bond," Alara continued, her voice rising above the rushing river, relentless and precise. "Alpha Jax knew I left. He made no attempt to find me. It was only when the Silver Moon Alliance demanded a show of military strength and territorial expansion that he conveniently declared me abducted. He used my name to manufacture a casus belli for this invasion." "Lies!" Jax roared, the panic finally snapping into blind, rabid fury. He looked at his warriors. "She has been brainwashed. Cassian has corrupted her mind. Attack! Bring down the keep!" Not a single Blood Moon warrior moved. Theron looked down at his boots. Lyra actively sheathed her sword. The loyalty Alara had bled for, the years of training and mutual survival, held stronger than the desperate command of a lying Alpha. Realizing he had lost his army, lost the council, and lost his new bride, Jax snapped. With a guttural roar, the sound of tearing flesh and snapping bone echoed off the canyon walls as Jax shifted. He bypassed the half-shift, exploding into a massive, heavily scarred timber wolf. He didn't charge Cassian. He lunged directly at Alara, his jaws snapping toward her throat, determined to silence the evidence of his treason permanently. Cassian tensed, a low growl vibrating in his chest, but he held his ground. He had promised Alara this. Alara didn't flinch. As the massive wolf leaped, she drew the twin obsidian daggers Cassian had given her. She didn't try to block the crushing weight of an Alpha. Instead, utilizing the exact fluid deflection she had taught Kale, she dropped low, sliding across the wet river stones beneath Jax's arc. In a blur of motion, she brought both blades up in a shallow, precise cut, slicing cleanly through the tendons behind Jax's front knees. Jax crashed violently into the icy water, a spray of white foam erupting around him. He howled in agony, his front legs collapsing beneath his weight. He thrashed, trying to find purchase on the slick stones, but the damage was done. The great Alpha of the Blood Moon was completely immobilized, reduced to a thrashing, pathetic heap in the shallow river. Alara stood slowly, shaking the freezing water from her blades. She looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. The ghost of her love was gone. "I spent 10 years defending your life, Jax," she said softly, the words for him alone. "Now, You aren't even worth killing." She turned her back on him, walking toward the imposing, unmoving figure of the Alpha King. Chapter 9. The King's Anchor. The judgment of the High Council was swift and merciless. Elder Vanya, her face a mask of furious disgust, formally stripped Jax of his alpha status on the banks of the Whispering Gorge. The Blood Moon Pack was placed under immediate council administration, pending a new trial of leadership. Serena, weeping and thoroughly humiliated, departed immediately with her Silver Moon escort, the political alliance dissolving before the sun even fully breached the canyon, as the disarmed Blood Moon forces prepared to march back south. Alara stood near the Ironhide transports. Theron and Lyra approached her, their heads bowed, exposing their necks in a gesture of absolute submission and apology. "Come back with us, Alara," Theron pleaded, his voice thick with emotion. "The pack needs an alpha. We need you. We will follow you, not the council." Alara looked at the bruised, exhausted faces of her former comrades. A deep, melancholic ache bloomed in her chest. But it was the ache of a closed chapter, not a bleeding wound. "I cannot, Theron," she said gently, reaching out to grip his shoulder. "My blood is in that soil, but my spirit is no longer tied to it. The Blood Moon must find a new path. I have found mine." Lyra wiped a tear from her dirt-streaked cheek. "Where will you go?" Alara didn't answer immediately. She glanced over her shoulder. Cassian stood by the lead transport, speaking quietly with Marcus. He wasn't watching her, wasn't pressuring her. He was simply waiting. "I am exactly where I need to be," Alara said. She gave them both a final, respectful nod, turning away from her past and walking toward the towering Alpha King. The drive back to the keep was a stark contrast to the tense mobilization of the night before. The vanguard was quiet, exhausted but victorious, sharing brief nods of profound respect as Alara passed them in the transport bay. Hours later, the adrenaline crash hit Alara like a physical blow. She stood in Cassian's private study, freshly showered and dressed in a soft, oversized sweater and dark leggings. The massive fireplace crackled, throwing warm, dancing light across the obsidian desk. The heavy oak doors clicked shut. Cassian walked in. He had discarded his armor, wearing only dark slacks and a loose Henley shirt that emphasized the sheer breadth of his chest. He moved to the crystal decanter, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid without asking, and crossed the room to hand her one. "It is over," Cassian said, his silver eyes catching the firelight. "The Council has sent a formal missive. The neutral zone borders are recognized as Ironhide protectorates. You prevented a war today, Alara." Alara took a sip, the heat of the whiskey grounding her. "We both know I just handed you the perfect excuse to expand your territory without shedding blood, King Cassian. You played the board perfectly." A slow, devastating smirk touched his lips. "I am a king. It is my nature to conquer. But I did not anticipate the prize being quite so formidable." Ilara's breath hitched slightly. The vast, quiet space of the study seemed to shrink, the air thickening with the familiar scent of petrichor and dark pine. She set her glass on a nearby table, crossing her arms defensively. "I am free of Jax," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "The bond is completely severed. So why do I still feel your anchor inside me? Why didn't you pull your energy back when the shock passed?" Cassian stepped closer. He didn't crowd her, but his immense presence demanded her full attention. The dominant, suffocating aura he had projected at the river was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, magnetic pull that made her dormant wolf pace restlessly beneath her skin. "I did not leave an anchor in you to bind you against your will, Alara," Cassian murmured, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that sent a shiver down her spine. When I reached into your spirit to block the agony of his betrayal, my wolf recognized yours. It wasn't a choice of magic or power. Elara stared at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Fated mates. The ancient, undeniable resonance of two souls meant to rule together. She had felt it the moment he touched her on the library floor, but the trauma of Jax's betrayal had blinded her to its true nature. You knew, she breathed. You knew I was your mate. I knew, he confirmed, reaching up slowly. His calloused fingers gently brushed a stray lock of damp hair behind her ear. The touch sent a jolt of electric heat straight to her core. But a mate forged in trauma is a prisoner. You needed to heal. You needed to stand on your own 2 feet, face the ghost of your past, and cut him down yourself. You needed to choose. Elara looked up into his luminous silver eyes. She saw no deception, no political calculation, no cowardly justifications. She saw a king who had recognized his equal and had given her the ultimate weapon, her own agency. She wasn't a broken runaway anymore. She was the architect of his defense. She was the warrior who broke an alpha without shedding a drop of blood. Elara uncrossed her arms. She stepped entirely into his space, letting the scent of the storm wrap around her. She raised her hands, resting them flat against the hard, warm expanse of his chest. Beneath her palms, his heart beat in perfect, steady rhythm with her own. I choose this, she whispered fiercely. Cassian's restraint shattered. His massive hands spanned her waist, pulling her flush against him. He kissed her, and it wasn't a tentative exploration. It was a claiming, a fiery, overwhelming surge of power, respect, and ancient magic that finally, completely filled the hollow void in her chest. Elara kissed him back with equal ferocity, her wolf howling in absolute, joyous surrender. The Alpha King had come for her in the dark, but it was the Queen who stepped into the light. In a world where loyalty is bought and love is cast aside for power, Elara learned that true strength isn't just surviving a betrayal. It's forging a new destiny from the ashes. She walked away from a cowardly alpha and stepped into the embrace of a king who didn't want to conquer her, but empower her. Their bond, born in the storm and forged in truth, proved that the greatest revenge is rising higher than those who tried to bury you. If you felt the tension, the heartbreak, and the ultimate triumph of Elara and Cassian's story, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this cinematic tale with your fellow fantasy and romance lovers. And subscribe for more high-stakes, dramatic stories where the underdogs become royalty. See you in the next adventure.